Well, this is a strange way to hold class, but it's a way to go, I suppose. I want to spend a little bit of time on that last PowerPoint deck that I sent. So if you can, you're sitting in my man cave, by the way. I guess it's better here than in a classroom, and this should be scotch, but it's not. Next time I'll give you a shot of the other side of the room. Want to go over this supply chain PowerPoint that I put up. Obviously, with this coronavirus and everything that's going on, it puts emphasis. I mean, this really underscores the economic impact of things that are happening with the supply chain, and that's what a lot of it is. You know, there are some of the cynical arguments, and you know, I'm not a big conspiracy theorist and so forth, but you know, when disruption happens, and this is clearly you know, some disruptive activity, when disruption happens, it has far-reaching economic consequences. We talk about the fact that there are winners and losers in this adventure we call globalization. So let me go through some of the supply chain PowerPoints, and then we'll talk a little bit more. So if you have that up in front of you, if not, if you can pull that up, obviously I'll go through the slides that I want to cover by title. So if we were to go to the first one, basically what is supply chain management, and you know, again, we're not going to use textbook definitions. You know, as grad students, we're obviously a bit beyond that. So you know, it goes through the undergrad notion of supply chain management, the design and management of flows of products, information, funds, and those are important factors clearly. And from a global management perspective, a strategic perspective, obviously this becomes a real issue. Later on we'll talk a little bit about tier 1, tier 2 supply elements in the supply chain. Usually that pertains to the automotive industry, perhaps the aircraft industry, but we need to get a sense of that and some of the alternates as well. So supply chain basically is the network of all entities involved in producing and delivering a finished product, or for that matter a service, to the customer and user. It includes the sourcing of raw materials, of parts, of manufacturing, producing and assembling sub-assemblies, other products, and it includes the idea or the notion of inventory and the storage and distribution of goods, and obviously tracking and all of the frictions, as we say in finance, that are associated with that. So supply chain stages obviously may include suppliers, producers, wholesale distributors, retailers, and then obviously the customer and so forth. And if you go to the next slide, what is supply chain 2? The stages of the supply chain that comprise the inbound direction towards the company are called upstream, and those that you know, go in the other direction are called downstream. Not going to spend a lot of time on that because that's more that course, but so we have at least a handle on some of the nomenclature. Then it goes through supply chain management activities, coordination, information sharing, and collaboration. You can read that. I'm not going to go through that. Managing flows through the supply chain. There are many flows that move through a supply chain network. That's become more apparent the last couple of weeks. First is the flow of products through the supply chain from the beginning of the chain through the various stages of production and so forth. Second is the flow of information, and that's, you know, sales data. A great example is Walmart. Many years ago they made this big EDI, electronic data interchange. They made that big EDI bet, spent a lot of money on infrastructure so that when you scan something at a Walmart, obviously it you know, records that in Bentonville and other places within about 15 minutes, but it also serves to adjust inventories and put things in motion and so forth. And then third, obviously, the third important flow through the supply chain is the funds. the payments for goods and services received, and we'll spend a little bit of time on that. Customer focus you can read for yourself, and the next slide says the bullwhip effect, and you can kind of read that for yourself as well, but the argument is that fluctuations and distortion of information increases as it moves up the supply chain, from the retailers to the manufacturers to the suppliers, and so forth. And they categorize this as the bullwhip effect and everything. I guess the key point there is asymmetric information. Because that, as much as anything else, can be hugely divisive to supply chains in general. If you think about it, the notion of supply chains was more the idea of partnering. Now, in another lifetime many years ago, when I did business internationally, and I'll pick on a domestic firm at the time, Eastman Kodak was one of my larger domestic clients. But Eastman Kodak, at the time, I believe, had in excess, when I started doing business with them, and I'll give you the year. It's the year I got out of the service, because, I'd done some Vietnam related service and things like that. But around 1980, Eastman Kodak had about 15,000 suppliers for all kinds of things, whether it was chemicals, whether it was raw material, bar stock, square stock, machine blocks, whatever. By the time I was done doing business with them, with the implementation of many technologies, just-in-time delivery was becoming popular and so forth, but one of the things that was astounding to me is that they ended up with slightly less than 1,500 suppliers, largely through what I would call partnering, because the idea is, look, instead of everybody beating their brains out in terms of competition, preferred suppliers that are then brought into the fold, given crucial information, partnering in terms of data and other information, became essential, became a survival tool. And in spite of that, due to what eventually would become known as the China price, Eastman Kodak, kind of went by the wayside substantially. But anyway, the idea is that what we see around us, the environmental issues I routinely talk about, economic, cultural, social, technological, political, legal, blah, 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 these all impact the supply chain. These all have the potential to disrupt supply chains, and when that happens, that has a major impact on business strategy, on economies, not just the firm, but the nation state, and as we can see, more of a global perspective. We get to the PowerPoint slide that says the service supply chain, and again, supply chain management is just as relevant to companies in the service business. And you don't need me to sit back and explain how. But look, for example, at whether it's MRIs, or whether it's providing IT support, or whether it's providing even retail financial support. We make a phone call because we lost a credit card. Well, I'm not sure it's somebody in Passaic, New Jersey that's picking up the phone. I'm quite certain it may be somebody in Mumbai, or it may be somebody in Vietnam someplace, etc., etc. You get the point that there is no specific location for services. And again, cheap is part of that calculus. You can read about intra-organizational integration, but the key points really are being able to deliver to the end user, the consumer presumably, in a cost-effective manner, and certainly cost efficiencies play into this a lot. So sourcing is the function responsible for linking the organization to its suppliers and ensuring an efficient supply of materials. Many times we talk about the logistics involved, and that has to do with positioning inventory and replenishing inventory and so on and so forth. But we're talking about supply chain contributors and elements and so forth. Next slide talks about cross-enterprise integration and so forth. And again, you can read that if you're interested in it. Slide after that deals with SCM versus logistics. Then we get to characteristics of a competitive supply chain. Three key characteristics: responsiveness, reliability, relationship management. I'll let you read that for yourself, other than the relationship management piece, which I want to just spend a minute on. Relationship building and collaboration. This is the essence of what was behind, for example, the Eastman Kodak move of going from in excess of 15,000 suppliers to 1,500 preferred suppliers. But there's a danger in that. And what's the obvious danger? Well, we're living it right now. I defy you to go and find Purell on the store shelves. Apparently, and I just found this out the other day, apparently things like bathroom tissue have disappeared from store shelves. I went into a ShopRite last night, and I know 8 p.m. not supposed to be on the roads and all of this, just to get a little backup on bottled water, mineral water, and things like this. Rationing. You can have 2 gallons of water, that's it. There are no cases of Poland Spring, 3 for $9 and all of this. That's all gone. Why? Supply chain issues. So it forces us to look for win-win relationships when we're creating these supply chains, but it also forces us to look in another direction as well. And we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes, but basically